Hello, I'm here to orient you to quantifying running records. So once you've opened the Google Drive and you're in the main menu, click on the running records folder, and then I'd like for you to click on quantifying running records. So after you've recorded your student and you're wanting to mark the miscues, you're going to use the blank form that is right here. But then this is how you're going to quantify your data. So here is the quantification sheet, but we're going to take a look at the Sam example. So for Sam, you can see that you've written the information written about him is up here, and he's read the book Dogs, and down here is his running record information. So you can see that it's a very primary book and there's just one sentence per page. But here on page 2, he has attempted the word some and he was told the word. Now again, you know not to do this, and read the rest of the words correctly. Page 3, he read all of the words correctly. Page 4, the last word on the page, he said scary for growly. Page 5, he said dogs for like, he repeated, and then he self-corrected during the repeat. Now remember, I told you to draw an arrow down to indicate to yourself that your student had self-corrected during the repeat. You can also mark it this way, where you have repeat first and then self-correction. That would also indicate it to you. Page 6, all of the words are read correctly. Page 7, again, repeated, and then self-corrected during the repeat, little for small. Dog is for dogs, self-corrected during the repeat. And then the child repeated, had said biggest for cuddliest, appealed, and was told. Again, you won't tell. Even when they appeal, you'll see what they can do. So those were Sam's miscues. So what you do after you have marked all of the miscues, or errors, you go to the count column and you're going to count errors and self-corrections. So this first one is an error because he was told, so you mark it as an error. If you have multiple errors, you would just write the total number in that line. Again, scary for growly is an error. This is dogs for like is a self-correction. Little for small is a self-correction, as is dog is for dogs, and biggest for cuddliest is an error. You then add up the columns and you put the numbers of the totals at the bottom. Going back to the top then, we're actually going to analyze the errors, and you can see in this column it says analysis of errors. So we look at this first one, S for some. He just attempts to say the word, isn't given really any time to figure out what the word is on his own. So over in the analysis of errors column, we write an MSV. Remember, M standing for meaning, S standing for structure, V standing for visual, semantic, syntactic, graphophonic. And the reason we write MSV in the error column is because we want to know what was the student relying on when they erred. So we can definitively say that he was relying on graphophonics because he was trying to sound out the word. Now we won't know what else he could have done because the teacher told him. So you circle visual here. Moving down to the next miscue, scary for growly, we write MSV because it is an error. And what is the child relying on when the child says scary for growly? Well, growly is not a very commonly used word in a 5-year-old's vocabulary. So imagining that maybe there was a scary dog on that page that was growling, it makes sense that a child would say scary for growly. Now, in an ideal world, we'd have the book Dogs and we could look at the page and know for sure, but we don't have that. You will have that because you'll be looking at the book the child read from when you're analyzing the data. So we can imagine by looking at the picture that the dog was scary if it was growly. So you're circling the child was relying on meaning by looking at the picture. And it's the same part of speech. So the child was relying on structure or syntax as well. Now, graphophonics. We count the number of letters that are the same. This is the word in print, growly. So they have 1, 2 letters. R and Y are the only 2 letters that the words have in common. So that does not reach the 50% threshold. There are 6 letters in growly. 2 out of 6 does not reach 50%. So we would not circle visual or graphophonics. Moving to dogs for like. This is the first self-correction. So you can see then when we have the analysis of the errors and self-corrections, we write MSV in both columns. And the reason that we do that is because we want to know what did the child rely on when they erred and what did the child rely on when they self-corrected. So dogs for like. M and S are circled, so what they're saying is that the child relied on meaning and structure and not graphophonics, which we can agree with because it has no letters in common. I would agree with meaning here because the book is about dogs, but even though structure, I didn't do this running record, but even though structure is circled, I would not agree with that just because it's not the same part of speech. The child is saying dogs for like, and that's a noun in a verb's place, and to me they're not really relying on structure. I would know better if I actually had the book to look at the sentence, but my inclination is to say that I don't agree with that. But the person who did this running record felt that S needed to be circled here. So that's what they relied on when they erred. What did they rely on when they self-corrected? I would agree with yes, they relied on graphophonics because the child was reading and said, all right, dogs does not look like. I'm going to repeat this sentence and fix that word. This is where I would have circled structure because when you go back to the beginning of the sentence and give it another running start, that's actually a syntactic strategy. So they're relying on structure or syntax there in making that self-correction. So I would have circled the S over here. Moving down to little for small. Again, this is a self-correction, so you're going to write MSV in the error column and in the self-correction column. What did they rely on when they erred? Meaning, I would agree. There was probably a little dog on the page, like a chihuahua or something, and so they said little for small. And then it is the same part of speech, so I can understand circling structure. When we look at the visual, the graphophonics, there aren't enough letters in common to justify circling visual. When you look at the self-correction, what were they relying on for self-correction? I would definitely say yes, they were relying on graphophonics because they probably realized, Sam did, that the word didn't match. But I would also have circled structured here as well, and it's okay if you circle the same letters in both sides because the child went back to the beginning and did a syntactic strategy. The last 2 errors, dog is for dogs, the child repeated and self-corrected. MSV in both columns. Error, what did he rely on when he erred? All of them are circled, and I agree with that because the child said dog is for dogs, so it's the 2 words that make up the contraction. We can tell at this point the child is inefficient in their reading because they are correcting contraction situations. What did they rely on when they self-corrected? Completely visual because they realized it didn't match exactly with the print. You could circle S here if you wanted to because the child did repeat the line to make the self-correction. Last error, biggest for cuddliest. If we can imagine an example like a sheepdog on the page, that big dog is very big. Cuddliest is probably not a word that the child uses commonly, so probably why they said biggest. But if you know what a sheepdog looks like, they're full of fur and they are very cuddly. So the child said biggest. So this is an error. was probably, yes, relying on meaning and was relying on structure because of the same part of speech, and the child probably looked at the picture and gathered meaning to say biggest. I honestly would circle visual here. I know that we don't reach the 50% threshold, but we have the EST completely at the end. We have the I in common, and then we have a double letter situation in the middle, which is like a ball and a stick situation with the D's and the G's. I would give credit to the student, and I'd probably circle visual here. Then what we do to quantify is we add up all of the M's, and we put the total down here. Same for the S's and the V's. And then in the self-correction column, we add up all the M's and add up that column as well as the structure and visual. So once you have done all of that, dang it all, sorry. Once you have added up all of those columns, then you're going to do some quantifying. That's where you rely on your boxes in the quantification sheet that is just above it. And remember, you work through your boxes. Box 1, box 2, box 3, and box 4. So down here you can see that the errors, the child had 3 errors, and the running words, if we were to count the words, there were 34 of them. And the child had 3 errors out of 34 running words. When we reduce that fraction down, it becomes 1 in 11.3. That's the error ratio. When we look at the quantification sheet, and remember I told you don't do the funny math, 1 in 11.3 is very close to between 90 and 91%. I would say it's 91%, but the person who did this marked it as 90%. So the error ratio is 1 in 11.3 for every 11.3 words they read. Sam read, he had 1 error. So his accuracy rate is 90%. Then his self-correction ratio. Remember, this is where, when we look at our quantification sheet, boy, I'm really good at doing that, sorry. When we look at our quantification sheet, to figure out our self-correction ratio, you take the number of self-corrections over the errors plus self-corrections. So for Sam, that would have been 3 over 3 plus 3, so 3 over 6, which reduces down to 1 out of 2. So for every 2 errors he made, he self-corrected 1 of them. That is pretty high. That means he's over self-correcting. Ideally, you're wanting it to be 1 in 4. So when we see that the child has read and has an accuracy rate of 90%, that indicates that that book is at their instructional level. Because remember, between 90 and 94 is instructional, 95 and above is easy, and 89 and below is considered hard. This right here. So that's why it's all written across on the instructional line. Okay? So this gives you quite a bit of information for the running record for Sam. Dogs is a really good book to use for teaching him something.